don't think it's a stretch to say that no deity in 40k has sparked nearly as much debate, discomfort, and straight-up confusion as the Dark Prince of Pleasure, Slaanesh. Depending upon who you ask, Slaanesh is either a fascinating and horrifying exploration of humanity's extremes, or an outdated caricature from Warhammer's early history that Games Workshop can't seem to figure out what to do with. As a character in a faction, Slaanesh and their units have undergone some pretty drastic and not always consistent changes over the years, from their overtly hedonistic and perverted origins to their modern portrayal as a god of excess in all of its forms. Slaanesh's identity has been rewritten, reinterpreted, and re-examined multiple times. Certain elements pertaining to them have been dialed up to 11, while others have been sanitized or censored. But has all of this ended up working out in Slaanesh's favor? Has it made them both more compelling from the audience's perspective, and probably more importantly, more marketable from Games Workshop's? Or has all of this left them in a strange, contradictory middle ground, where neither the lore nor their model line accurately reflects what She Who Thirst is supposed to represent? I'm just gonna let you know right now, even though I consider myself a fan of Slaanesh, I've got a lot of problems with them. From Games Workshop's confused and contradictory messaging about what Slaanesh is supposed to be, to a model line that is somehow creatively bankrupt despite being attached to one of the most diverse characters in the entire setting, to the lore itself, where despite having had more than 20 years to figure this out, Slaanesh still feels out of place and underutilized within the Chaos pantheon. In this video, we're going to explore Slaanesh's early real-world history, how they were first introduced to us in the late 80s, and how they've morphed into their more modern interpretation. We're also going to be examining all of the problems that surround this particular Chaos deity, in order to figure out why Games Workshop seems to be so hesitant to utilize them in any meaningful way. Also, a quick content warning: due to the nature of this particular topic, we're going to be discussing things of a more sexual nature and the role that sex plays in Slaanesh's lore, their model range, and overall brand. There's not going to be any graphic imagery or anything like that, but I just figured I'd give you the heads up in case you're watching this video with kids or family around. Anyways, with all that said, let's dive headfirst into the grimdark. But first, this video is sponsored by Into the AM, makers of some of the best graphic tees that you can get on the internet. Now, if you've been watching my content for a long time, then you know that Into the AM's basically been with us since the beginning. They're the longest running sponsor that we've ever had on this channel. So I just wanted to extend a huge thank you to all of you for making that so successful. I've been wearing their products for over 2 years now, and I'm a huge fan of their brand. Their shirts are easily the comfiest that I own. Not only that, but they have a massive catalog of different designs, so no matter who you are, they've got a shirt that's perfect for you. And speaking of which, if you didn't know, they just dropped a whole bunch of new ones. I love what their artists are able to come up with. Their designs are unique, loud, and colorful without ever feeling too over the top. So going into this new year, you can bet that I'm personally planning on upgrading my wardrobe by picking up a whole bunch of these new shirts. And if you're like me and you also want to elevate your style, I've got some good news. Into the AM gives my viewers 10% off their entire order when you go to intotheam.com/WesHammer or use code WesHammer at checkout. Again, that's intotheam.com/WesHammer or use code WesHammer at checkout to save 10% off your entire order. The link's in the description down below. Big thanks to Into the AM for sponsoring this video. Before we dive into the real meat and potatoes of all of the big problems surrounding Slaanesh, including Games Workshop's indecisiveness about what to do with them, we need to know how they were originally portrayed in Warhammer's early lore. Honestly, it's kind of ironic, because many Warhammer fans, myself included, and even Games Workshop themselves, will tell you that Slaanesh isn't just a sex god. They are the god of excess in all of its forms, and sexuality is only a very tiny, minuscule part of the grand spectrum of excess. Though this is without a doubt true, it didn't always used to be like this. In fact, when Slaanesh made their debut in the second Realm of Chaos book Slaves to Darkness in 1989, the Dark Prince really was only concerned with a very specific type of excess. On the very first page in the Slaanesh section, it states that Slaanesh is first and foremost the Lord of Pleasure, the power of chaos dedicated to the pursuit of hedonistic pleasures and the overthrow of all codes of decent behavior. He reigns in a vast and luxuriously appointed palace in the void, where favored followers litter the floors, indulging themselves in all forms of perverse pleasures of the flesh. Worship of Slaanesh takes the form of great orgies involving every vice and perversity. All are welcome within the cults of Slaanesh. The only requirement is an unswerving dedication to the pursuit of pleasure and a willingness to explore every possible vice and perversion. Later on, in the section dedicated to the servants of Slaanesh, namely their demons, it states that when amassed on the field of battle, the electric colors of their contorted forms offend the eye as their diseased lewdness offends the mind. Half-bared torsos of pink and blue boast of unreined lust. Others display limbs of glistening greens and yellows, pale shades of corruption which belie the darkness they hide inside. They have abandoned the last vestiges of true decency and sacrificed their humanity to serve the dark power of the master of carnal joys and spread his corruption amongst the innocent. So that's some pretty heavy stuff, but let's compare it to something a bit more modern. Now, I'm personally reading from the 8th edition Demon Codex, as it's the one I currently have available, but you'll find similar depictions in the 9th edition version as well. And make a note of how similar the text is, but the things that do change are pretty important. Here it states that Slaanesh is the Lord of Pleasure, the dark god dedicated to the pursuit of earthly gratification and the overthrow of all decent behavior. He is the god of obsession, the master of excess in all things, from gluttony to lust to megalomania. Wherever mortals are ruled by their own unquenchable desires, the Dark Prince is there in the shadows, whispering, tempting, and feasting on a banquet of souls. Slaanesh's legions of excess strike with sinuous grace, hitting the foe in a whirling blur of lithe and bladed limbs. As they do so, they are at once horrific and alluring, mesmerizing and loathsome. Slaanesh's demon legions vary in composition and purpose, but all desire to spread their lord's corruption. Although neither one of these versions goes into any kind of graphic depictions of not safe for work material, when you compare them side by side, it's clear that the original version was much more overtly sexual in nature. It had a lot more direct references to the pleasures of the flesh, carnal desires, and straight-up worship in the form of orgies. Now, years later, those elements have been toned down, and Slaanesh is not just the god of pleasure, but a god of excess. Those direct references to sex have been exchanged for more nebulous concepts, like, quote, earthly gratification or unquenchable desires. As technically speaking, there's no reason that those concepts couldn't come in the form of physical intimacy, but they could also apply to a million different things. There's a feeling of coyness in the modern text, both a wink and a plausible deniability. It's like the author is saying that if you hear those terms and the first thing you think of is sexual activity, then that's on you. We're not implying anything specific. In the same vein, sex-adjacent descriptive language can be found in abundance. Words like hedonistic, desire, seductive, sensual, temptation, and many more are thrown around freely, but never in direct reference to pleasure in the form of sexual gratification. If you still don't believe me that Slaanesh used to be way more sexual, then I'd like to present to you the very first Warhammer 40K novel ever written, Inquisitor by Ian Watson, which was later re-released under the title Draco. This book gave us our very first look at what a city of Slaanesh on a demon world actually looked like. And before I get into this, I'm just going to be honest with you, I kind of thought about cutting this segment as it's almost certain to get me demonetized, but it is a piece of Warhammer's history that most people don't know about, so I think it's important to include it here. If you want to help me make up for that and you haven't subscribed to the channel already, go ahead and do so and we'll call it even. But again, fair warning, it's pretty graphic. Luminous veils drip from the glowing soup of the night sky. The buildings of the city ahead were gross idols to corrupted pleasure. Some of those buildings were modeled to represent lascivious deities, many-breasted, many-organed avatars of twisted lust. In the weird veil light, the hunchback shadows of dark gods seemed to brood everywhere. Spouts of flaming gas leapt up, adding further spasmodic illumination. Other great buildings were giant mutated solo genitalia. Horned phallic towers arose, wrinkled, ribbed, blistered with window pustules. Cancerous breast domes swelled, fondled by scaly-fingered buttresses. Tongue bridges linked these buildings, sliding back and forth. Scrotum pods swayed, orifice entries pulsed open and shut, glistening. Some buildings were incongruous with each other, headless, limbless torsos laying side by side, joined abominably. Through his magnoscope, Jack spied nipples that were heavy-duty laser nacelles and lingam shafts that were projectile tubes. The inhabitants were mere ants by comparison, with this architectonic orgy, eager, scurrying ants. Jack's earbead picked up wailing music, drum beats, screams, chants, and the throb of machinery. The city pulsed and palpitated flexibly. Somehow, plasteel and the immaterium were alloyed together. Thus, buildings moved, butted one another, penetrated one another, crawled upon one another. Towers bowed and stiffened, the deity buildings caressed and clawed at one another, and the ant-like inhabitants swarmed within, around, and over, sometimes being crushed, sometimes sucked into vents or spewed out. So this Slaanesh city, which again is representative of the deity's essence as it was written at that point in time, is a literal city made out of titties and dangus. But tell me again that Slaanesh has never been just about sex, Games Workshop. Like, what the f? I'm not gonna read out the rest because it somehow gets even more graphic, and honestly reading it in its entirety would add like another 20 minutes to this video. But in the very next scene, we're introduced to a gigantic rotund woman with a cow face that was said to have, quote, rows of tattooed oily bosoms and a hosepipe-sized birth cord in the shape of a writhing serpent that she is seemingly copulating with at all times. This massive beast is borne on a huge resplendent palanquin and is being escorted by an array of bare-headed trader marines. At one point, she starts calling out in a voice loud enough to crack stone and rupture eardrums for her minotaur lover named Bool. She starts screaming about how she wishes to be hung from the ceiling by 100 rings. The whole thing is graphic and uncomfortable to read, but it gives you a really good idea of what Slaanesh was supposed to be like in their earliest incarnations. Absolutely filthy.
Could you give us some of your political beliefs?
Kill everyone now. Condone first-degree murder. Advocate cannibalism.
Now, obviously, this is not the way Slaanesh is depicted in modern 40K, and I think we can all agree that that's probably for the best. In addition to them becoming the god of excess instead of just the god of pleasure, there was also an increased emphasis put on pain and violence. In their lore, torture would end up becoming a common insert for hedonistic and depraved tendencies over overtly carnal desire. With pleasure now being a small facet of excess, Slaanesh would end up having a lot of nuance added to their lore. In addition to the increased levels of violence and more emphasis being put on Slaanesh's darker themes, they and their associated faction became a much better fit in the grimdark future of Warhammer 40K, a franchise famously characterized by endless war. Although some people for some reason might prefer the original version, in my opinion Slaanesh nowadays is a much more interesting entity. But perhaps more importantly, from Games Workshop's perspective, they're also now a lot more marketable. Although still certainly lacking the broad appeal of something like Loyalist Space Marines, their previous incarnation as an army of sex pests was only ever going to appeal to a pretty small niche group of players. In addition, as Games Workshop is a global corporation that sells models in a lot of different countries, many of whom have laws that restrict what can and cannot be depicted, this change allowed them to avoid a lot of legal issues as they began to expand. However, I do have a lot of issues with Slaanesh's redesign, and that's mostly that the lore may have been updated, but the visual elements of Slaanesh have not, namely the art and model line. By the time they got around to making these changes, Slaanesh's brand identity had already been firmly established. For a corporation trying to sell a product, deviating from an established brand is always a risky proposition. If you make too many big changes too quickly, you risk alienating your established customer base that already enjoyed the product as it was before. Even the most subtle of alterations could have enormous consequences in the market. For Games Workshop, this change has resulted in a disconnect between Slaanesh's lore and their model range. They seemingly want to go in one direction with them, but they're still shackled to an outdated brand that they're hesitant to move away from. To me, the Slaanesh models that are available in the 40K tabletop game right now are a direct visual representation of Games Workshop's internal confusion on what to do with Slaanesh and their indecisiveness when it comes to exploring other aspects of this particular deity. But let's explore this a bit deeper by looking at some of these models and their associated artwork, and thus how they're represented in the 40K universe. As from my perspective, even though I like Slaanesh as a deity and as a faction, it's kind of a confused mess. To get the pros out of the way first, on the surface level, the overall design philosophy that governs how a Slaaneshi unit should look succeeds in being unique and distinct from the other deities. You're never going to confuse a Slaaneshi demon or mortal as a follower of Nurgle. Traditionally speaking, their units have a much wider color palette than other followers of Chaos, though pinks and purples are predominant. Nudity has been mostly removed from modern sculpts, but is still paid lip service via asynchronous exposed breasts, but these are exclusive to non-humanoid creatures such as fiends and seekers. With the exception of Space Marine units and a couple of mortal units from the Age of Sigmar line, heavy armor is almost non-existent within Slaaneshi factions. Both mortal and demon followers alike are often depicted with a lot of exposed skin, and an attire consisting of elegant fabrics or clothing that draws heavy inspiration from BDSM culture, normally consisting of leather straps, harnesses, corsets, chains, whips, piercing, and a bunch of tasteful thigh highs. So with that out of the way, let's talk about the negatives, and I'll admit this is definitely me being a bit nitpicky and thinking way too hard about this particular subject, but if the visual language used in a character's design is supposed to tell me at a glance what they're all about, the Slaanesh model line fails miserably, especially when compared to the other deities. The design elements that are a core component of Slaanesh's brand are all about sex. It's no wonder that newcomers to Warhammer often assume that Slaanesh is the god of perversion specifically, because when you look at all of their units, that's the only message being conveyed to the audience. It gets even weirder when you realize that older Slaaneshi models used to be way more sexual. Just look at the famous Juan Diaz sculpts for the Demonettes before their modern equivalent came out in 2008. So Slaanesh models were toned down to be a bit more PG-13, which personally I don't really have an issue with. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not a prude and I have no problem with nudity or R-rated models, but Warhammer is a social game played in shared spaces that often have a lot of people that are underage, whether they're playing Warhammer themselves or they're just kind of existing in that space playing something else. Toning it down was ultimately for the best, and if players want something a bit more risque, there are tons of third-party companies that make proxies that they can purchase. Not sponsored by them, but shout out to CreatureCaster as they're my personal favorite. I mean, just look at this proxy for a Keeper of Secrets, it's amazing. Anyways, the major issue that I have with the direction that Games Workshop has decided to go in is the often worsening disconnect between the lore and the models. Again, the lore tells us that Slaanesh is not a sex god, that sexuality is the tiniest portion of what they represent, and that excess comes in infinite different forms. Yet, all of the changes that they've made to existing models and new kits that have been released are doubling down on Slaanesh's sexual side, just in the safest, no-teeth, milquetoast way possible. They may have covered up the titties, but they did so with BDSM gear. Now, I'm not new to Warhammer. I've been into this stuff for 20 years, so sometimes it's admittedly difficult for me to try to see something through the eyes of a newcomer. But I guarantee if you were to place an army from each one of the 4 gods in front of a new player that doesn't have any context or knowledge of the lore, they're instantly going to be able to pick up on demons of rage, plague, sorcery, and ultimately sex. Where is the wide spectrum of excess with these models? How is any vice other than gooning being represented here? And to be fair, if I had to give any kind of credit here, I would point to the Fiends of Slaanesh as actually being kind of representative of excess. They're a fusion of animal, demon, and human parts into a grotesque amalgamation that still stays faithful to the design guidelines for Slaanesh. But once again, this was a design that's existed since the late 80s when Slaanesh was the pleasure god, and the excess that is on display here, it really is just an excess of legs, titties, and bondage. Now, ironically, some effort to correct this has been made, but it's done exclusively in the Age of Sigmar line of models. By its very nature, gluttony goes hand in hand with excess, and glutos here perfectly encapsulates this often underexplored aspect of Slaanesh. Likewise, the excess of pride and vanity is definitely in line with modern Slaanesh, and we see that perfectly in the Prince of Slaanesh, Sigvald, with his mewing face, flowing hair, and polished armor. Now, I'm not a huge Sigmar lore guy, but apparently this guy's honor guard all fight with shields that have been polished to a mirror finish, so Sigvald here can watch himself as he fights. It's great, and I love it. Now, the Keeper of Secrets model is playable in both game systems, and though it definitely fits the established brand language for Slaanesh that we discussed before, such as the skewing of armor in the favor of fine silks being draped around them thing going on, but it's not really excess. There's no real excess being explored here. Meanwhile, over here with the named Keepers of Secrets that are exclusive to Age of Sigmar, their clothing takes excess to the absolute extreme. I mean, just look at those gaudy bastards. If those clothes aren't excessive, I don't know what is. So what is the major issue here? Why do Slaanesh units in 40K look the way that they do, in that sexuality is the exclusive theme being pushed, if Games Workshop has been making active efforts to get away from this for 2 decades? Well, unfortunately, we don't really know the truth, as Games Workshop hasn't made any concrete information pertaining to this publicly available. But I did waste 4 years of my life and way too much money getting a bachelor's degree in marketing with a focus on design, so I'm gonna go ahead and actually use that degree for once and make some educated guesses. There's a few different things going on here, but the most important one is that even though Slaanesh's lore has changed and become more nuanced, their overall visual brand has not. It was established in a different time, when Slaanesh was a different thing. Deviating from an established brand identity is always a risky move, even for the most subtlest of changes. This is something that is true of all brands in every industry and every market, and billions of dollars are spent each and every year on market research when it comes to updating them. A model line for Games Workshop is no exception, as they are incredibly protective of their IP and notoriously slow to adopt change. The designers are forced to work within these established guidelines, even if they're outdated. Now, the reason we see actual change occurring in the Sigmar line is likely that their teams are given a lot more creative freedom than the 40K teams. I don't have any source on this, but it makes sense if you think about it. Sigmar is not the cash cow that 40K is, nor does it even have a fraction of the lore, history, media, and associated products that its larger cousin does. From my perspective, it's apparent that if the Sigmar team wants to try out something new, they're more than welcome to do so. Sigmar's universe is still in a somewhat malleable state, whereas 40K by contrast has become set in stone. If the Sigmar team wants to experiment with steampunk sky dwarves, elves riding around on sea monsters, the bone daddies, or kangaroo elves, they can go buck wild. If any of the changes they make or any of their designs don't end up working out, they can just scrap them and go back to the drawing board. From a designer's perspective, this is kinda great, even though it's not exactly great for the players who invested in those products. Which, quick tangent, Games Workshop owes Beast of Chaos and Stormcast players an actual non-corporate speak apology, but that's a topic for a different video. The 40K team is clearly not afforded the same level of creative freedom. Their designers, although incredibly talented, seem to be stuck between a rock and a hard place. They can't deviate from the established brand identity. They still have to keep things sexual, but not too sexual. And they can't try anything truly new without first having to navigate through millions of miles of red tape and consulting an army of lawyers and marketers. I thought about cutting this analogy as it's not perfect, but imagine if Games Workshop overhauled the Space Wolves lore so they didn't just venerate wolves, but they venerated all animals. Lions, tigers, bears, ravens, hell, let's throw some lizards and spiders in there too. But over the next 20 years, the only thing that we ever saw represented in their models was wolves, wolves, and even more wolves. It's a commonly held belief that whether in the form of models or rules, Age of Sigmar often ends up acting like a testing ground for 40K. Ideas that prove themselves successful over there will end up being transported into the larger franchise, as to minimize the risk to Games Workshop's bread and butter. So who knows, maybe in the future the Slaanesh model line will end up actually exploring different forms of excess, which in my personal opinion would be great. It would be much more in line with the lore. But that being said, the problems with Slaanesh unfortunately would not be fixed. In fact, many of their issues I don't think can be fixed, as they stem from the idea of excess itself, and Slaanesh's confused identity within the Chaos Pantheon. Another major problem with Slaanesh is that they tend to overlap pretty substantially with each of the other gods, so much so that it's a bit of a meme to debate whether or not something is actually secretly empowering Slaanesh. Nurgle, Khorne, and Tzeentch don't really have this issue. They each stay within their own lane. Now, it's true that all of the gods have a ridiculous amount of nuance, and if you dig deep enough, you will find some places where they intersect. But for the most part, this is pretty minimal. Khorne is the god of rage, bloodshed, and murder, and thus all of his followers are frothing barbarian psychopaths. Nurgle is the lord of plague, disease, and despair, so his followers are bloated with rot and pestilence and have a sour, somber, and depressed personality. Tzeentch is the lord of sorcery, lies, and treachery, so his followers are constantly scheming and chasing down forbidden lore in order to grow into more powerful sorcerers. Back in the day when Slaanesh was simply the Dark Prince of Pleasure, they too fit into their own unique niche. But now that they are the god of excess, it gets considerably more complicated to define how they and their followers actually fit into the pantheon. Is excess not on full display with each of the other gods? Aren't emotions taken to their extreme kind of the entire point of chaos as a whole? Do Khorne and his followers somehow not represent an excess of rage and hatred? It seems like there was a pretty solid attempt to make Slaanesh distinct in the form of making them representative of all of humanity's vices. To add to this, their own personal realm clearly takes inspiration from Dante's Inferno and presents Slaanesh as representative of the 7 deadly sins. In the lore, it states that Slaanesh's realm is made of 6 rings with their palace at the center. The first ring tests an individual's greed, the second their gluttony, the third their lust, the fourth and fifth both a mixture of their envy and pride, and finally the sixth their sloth. The only sin not really represented here is wrath, which is understandable as that's kind of Khorne's whole bag. But when you stop to think about it, aren't most of these sins also represented by the other Chaos gods? Isn't gluttony and sloth strongly associated with Nurgle? Isn't envy and greed a hallmark of Tzeentch and their followers? What you have here is a deity that's supposed to represent excess in all of its forms, being explored further by a Chaos realm representative of the 7 deadly sins. Yet since those deadly sins are already firmly established as intrinsic parts of the other Chaos deities, the only 2 that are really left for Slaanesh is lust and pride, which again is withholden to their original design philosophy that Games Workshop is supposedly trying to get away from. And hell, honestly, let's take pride off the table as well, as all demons are prideful by their very nature, so all they've got is lust. So Slaanesh really is just a sex god after all. Ultimately, it's a shame, because I really like Slaanesh. I think their lore is fascinating, and when used correctly, they can be incredibly creepy. I love how one of their cults was depicted in the Horus Heresy novel Vengeful Spirit. I love that creepy gross old dude that suddenly becomes jacked and beautiful and the best damn night pilot you ever did see. I also love Slaanesh's depiction on the smaller and more intimate scale, like the horror story Pentimento, which gives us a fascinating and unnerving look at just how subtle and creepy Slaaneshi corruption really is. Which, by the way, I made a Grimdark Story Hour video on that one, so definitely check it out. There are so many interesting elements to Slaanesh, more so than any of the other gods. The Dark Prince can be depicted in 1,000 different ways with 1,000 different unique stories to tell. As somebody who's obsessed with the Black Library novels, I genuinely really enjoy how open to interpretation Slaanesh can often be. You never really know what you're going to get with them, and it makes them one of the most fun gods to read about. But on the macro perspective, when we're looking at the entirety of the 40K franchise, the huge disconnect that exists between what we are told and what we are shown makes it clear that even though Games Workshop claims they want them to be more than just a god of pleasure, they aren't really fully willing to commit to that new direction. Which honestly, side note, it's baffling to even call it a new direction, as these changes were made like 2 decades ago. Warhammer is a crazy, bombastic, over-the-top universe where everything is taken to its extremes. But when Games Workshop is writing for or creating models for the deity that's literally supposed to represent extremes, there's suddenly this weird, uncanny timidness. Personally speaking, I don't think Games Workshop actually knows what they want Slaanesh to be. I believe that any potential path forward is always held back by factors of both indecision within the company and marketing. The end result being a sloppy, confused mess. But what do you think of all this? Do you agree with all the points I made in this video, or do you think I've missed the point entirely? Do you like the way Slaanesh is currently depicted, or do you think it would be better if Games Workshop just didn't hold back? How do you think Slaanesh compares to the other Chaos gods? And not just in matters of coolness, but in design, marketability, and their place within both 40K's lore and the wider franchise. Personally speaking, I'm getting kind of tired of seeing Nurgle and Khorne represented in all of the video games, and I want Darktide to add demonettes. Do it, you cowards, make it weird. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, we're on the road to 1 million subs, so do your part in the long war and help us reach that goal. It's free, and you'll be one of the cool guys that was here before 1 million. Anyways, let me know all of your thoughts, questions, comments, concerns, and ideas for future videos down in the comment section below. A big thanks to everyone who supports all the work that I do, and I will catch you all in the next one.